To the shock of the world, the two-day meetings between the US and China in Anchorage, Alaska, wrapped up after an unusual fiery kickoff on Thursday. As the first high-level in-person talks since Biden took office, what can we interpret from the meetings? Why did Biden feel proud instead of being humiliated after Yan Jiechi mocked the US human rights and strength? Welcome to KSJ-Bridging the Gap. This is Sarah. Before we go on with today's episode, please subscribe, like, and turn on the notification bell. The ill-tempered talks in Anchorage were an unusually undiplomatic sparring match to people in the world, especially when the meetings were called to take stock of the US-China relationship under a new American administration. The talks involved Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on the US side, facing off with China's top foreign policy official Yan Jiechi and Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Blinken was quite direct and tough at the opening speech. He's much tougher than Biden in his attitude towards the communist regime, in my opinion.
Our administration is committed to leading with diplomacy, to advance the interests of the United States, and to strengthen the rules-based international order. We'll also discuss our deep concerns with actions by China, including in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion toward our allies. Each of these actions threaten the rules-based order that maintains global stability. That's why they're not merely internal matters, and why we feel an obligation to raise these issues here today.
However, when Yan Jiechi spoke for over 60 minutes, well over the 2 minutes that had been agreed ahead of the talks, his response was too weak, although he stopped the reporters so they could get his point that China had immediately violated the agreed-to protocol.
Given your extended remarks, permit me please to add just a few of my own before we get down to work, and I know Mr. Sullivan may have a few things to say as well. I have to tell you, in my short time as Secretary of State, I've spoken to, I think, nearly 100 counterparts from around the world, and I just made my first trip, as I noted, to Japan and South Korea. I have to tell you, what I'm hearing is very different from what you described.
His response was even interpreted as an apology and triggered more furious accuse from Yan Jiechi.
我们把你们想得太好了，我们认为你们会遵守基本的外交礼节。
Well, I think we thought too well of the United States. We thought that the U.S. side will follow the necessary diplomatic protocols.
所以我们刚才必须阐明我们的立场。
So for China, it was necessary that we make our position clear.
我现在讲一句，你们没有资格在中国的面前说你们从实力的地位出发同中国谈话。
So let me say here that in front of the Chinese side, the United States does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength.
The U.S. delegation was thoroughly mocked, and yet Biden said he was proud of Blinken. The U.S. officials took it as an exaggerated diplomatic presentations aimed at a domestic audience in front of the cameras, and didn't call it out immediately. Thus, as soon as media had left the room, the two sides immediately got down to business and held substantive and direct talks, according to a senior U.S. administration official. If it were former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, what would he have done?
Let me just put you in that position. Let's say this was you yesterday. I've known you a long time. You're a pretty tough guy. What would your response have been?
Yeah, I would have called it out for exactly what it is. This idea somehow that America isn't a beacon of democracy around the world, that's just nonsense, and it is crazy for them to make that attack. You know, they mentioned, too, you shouldn't forget, Sean, they mentioned Black Lives Matter as part of the reason they think American democracy is in decline. Those are running buddies of Marxist-Leninists all around the world. And so when they see a Democrat Party that is so deeply tied to the Black Lives Matter movement, I think they sense that America may well be in decline. I would have made clear that America stands for protecting its own. I would have reiterated our views about America first. We would have talked about the greatness and the exceptionalism of our nation, and we would have called them out for what they did to the world with this virus that has destroyed millions of lives. We've lost millions of lives and billions of dollars worth of wealth. It is unacceptable that the administration didn't push back in that way.
That's the point. The CCP thinks American democracy is in decline, especially after the chaos during the 2020 presidential election. In their eyes, how could someone who took office in the White House through shameless means and with their assistance be qualified to talk about democracy? Let alone to say the interests of the Biden family and Beijing are inextricably linked. After Biden's first phone call with Xi Jinping, he had expressed his willingness to cooperate with Beijing, although he has to pretend that he is taking a tough stance towards the CCP because 45% of Americans now say China is the greatest enemy of the US, more than double the percentage who said so in 2020, according to the most recent Gallup poll. And a new high of 63% of Americans says the economic power of China is a critical threat to the vital interests of the U.S. in the next 10 years, including 56% of Democrats. That means even the majority of Democrats hold this view. He wants to cooperate with the CCP and at the same time to create an image that he is tough at the CCP to avoid criticism in the U.S. So Biden offered the opportunity to meet the Chinese. Isn't that strange that he invited the CCP when his China policy is still unclear yet? So on the surface, they have played some mind games by making arrangements and creating the impression that they were taking a tough approach to China. For example, they deliberately chose the frozen Alaska as the meeting location. They did not arrange lunch for the Chinese delegation. Blinken and Sullivan came to Alaska on the way back from their Northeast Asia tour. They announced the sanctions on the 24 Chinese officials over the Hong Kong crackdown ahead of the meetings, etc. In response, the CCP detained 6 American students who attend New York University in Shanghai for no reason. And they put a Canadian citizen on trial on spying charges and potentially plan to hold the trial of another Canadian on Monday. Both cases embroiled in a wider diplomatic spat between the US and China. Obviously, there are more cards to play in the US side. But the meetings are very important for Xi Jinping. China insisted in its propaganda that it is a strategic dialogue, although the US side has explicitly rejected that, calling it a one-off session. So the summit itself becomes a trap well designed by the CCP to achieve several goals. First of all, to help Xi Jinping shift the ever-growing domestic contradiction and gain advantage for his internal struggle with the Jiang Zemin faction. He needs to display his strong image in the world stage to fool the Chinese people and prolong his political life as a single authority. From this point of view, the US officials were right. Xi was aiming at a domestic audience. In this short video clip, we can see that Yan Jiechi did not even plan to have his speech translated at the first place. That's why he talked about 16 minutes and the translation was only more than 3 minutes. He was doing a pre-arranged show and his audience was the Chinese people. So his full speech can be found everywhere on the Chinese website. China-US hold timely, helpful, high-level strategic dialogue was Saturday's headline in the Chinese state news service Xinhua. Hu Xijin, the editor-in-chief of the state-controlled Global Times, wrote in an op-piece, "I believe China and US had a really good quarrel during the Alaska talks on Friday. Secondly, Xi is testing Biden's bottom line." Yan Jiechi drew a red line for the US in his speech. He said the US is not qualified to lead the world, has no right to criticize China for its system and for violating human rights. He implies that the CCP is not afraid of confrontation with the United States, which is a means to deter the United States so the US may retreat without a fight. That's why Hu Xijin wrote that the heated opening of the summit cleared the way for progress on more substantive issues. That's why Yan Jiechi told CGTN, the CCP's official media, that the two-day negotiations were frank constructive, and useful. The Biden administration had fallen into the CCP's traps. But lots of Chinese netizens do not buy the CCP's propaganda, saying that there are two sides in the quarrel. Why only release the video showing how we scolded the other? Why dare not to release the video of the other side? Some said, don't pretend to represent the people. The performance of the stock market reflected the people's response. We had a Black Friday. So from this perspective, both sides are playing their roles in the show to achieve their own goals. That explains why the US still seeks cooperation from the CCP after the fierce confrontation on Thursday. Blinken talked at the press conference that the two sides had intersecting interests on Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan, and climate change, and that the United States had accomplished during the meetings what it had come to do. In fact, nothing had accomplished in the US side other than being humiliated. But the CCP succeeded in pushing to the bottom line of the Biden administration. They figured out that they can do anything to the US without getting any consequences. If Blinken canceled the meetings immediately after Yan Jiechi humiliated the US, then the CCP will change their attitude accordingly. They couldn't afford to lose the opportunity to restore the relationship. They need the US more than the US needs Beijing. However, after the summit, the CCP will become more and more dangerous, and soon its long arm will probably extend to Taiwan. As Pompeo said, weakness begets war. It begets hostility.
More importantly, it's dangerous. When the Chinese Communist Party sees weakness, perceives weakness, they'll act just like you saw in that room in Anchorage yesterday. You've seen them now observe what the administration is doing with Iran. They've seen us get back into the Paris Climate Accords, an enormous gift to the Chinese Communist Party. They've seen us rejoin the World Health Organization, which gave the Chinese a complete pass for the Wuhan virus. When they sense this weakness, they'll act just as they did. They will bully us. They will take advantage of us. We need leadership from the United States that demonstrates resolve with respect to the Chinese Communist Party, the way President Trump and our team did. If we don't do that, Sean, we're in an awful lot of trouble. There is real risk. Weakness begets war. It begets hostility. And it appears that the Chinese Communist Party believes that this administration will be weak on China.
It is truly unfortunate that the United States is projecting weakness under the Biden administration. Not just China, Russia, and North Korea see it too. They are not buying into the US democratic spin anymore, and the situation may get worse. KSJ, Bridging the Gap.